Good morning, folks. Okay, somebody sent me a report in the SOT, which stands for Sign of the Times, and it's dated 15th of October. And the headline is Coronavirus Test and Trace Consultants Paid Equivalent of 1.5 million salary. It says the government is paying individual private sector consultants £1 million wages to work on its test and trace system, according to documents seen by Sky News. Some executives from Boston Consulting Group, BCG, helping the government set up and run its testing system, are being paid day rates of around £7,000, equivalent to an annual salary of 1.5 million. While individual consultants may only receive a portion of that sum, it's still considerably more than any other public sector worker. The revelation is the latest evidence of the expenses of the government's testing scheme, which is budgeted to cost $12 billion this year, making it one of the most expensive government programmes in recent years. Now, you've got to take on board that whatever the government is spending is your tax. So when we see government they're spending your money because you're being held liable for the borrowing that they're doing to fund this nonsense. Not only that, take on board the fact that the military are involved in this test and trace nonsense, which means the military would be getting paid as though they were in the private sector. I mean, these are the points that we need to start to realise that's actually happening here, that our entire English, Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish cash systems are being usurped by the private realm, and then they are offering back what we already are, the pennies, to come join them. There's big money going on here, and like I said, you're paying for it. You've got to remember this. It says, according to documents, the government has paid BCG around $10 million for a team of around 40 consultants to do 4 months' work on the testing system between the end of April and late August, and that's this year. But while the government pays the consultancy, that fee is determined by the day rates of the individuals working on it. So it's an open-ended contract. BCG has a range of day rates for public sector work, and while these are generally lower than the rates they charge in the private sector, they nonetheless range from $2,400 to $7,360 for the most senior consultants. According to the document seen by Sky News, BCG is giving the Department of Health and Social Care a 10 to 15% discount for its work. However, this would still equate to a day rate equivalent to a 1.5 million annual salary. The revelation has come amid growing consternation about the cost of Britain's COVID-19 testing system and question marks over value for money, given problems suffered by the system in recent months. Labour MP Tony Perkins raised the matter during the House of Commons debate on contract tracing on Wednesday afternoon. Occasionally you get a story that seems in itself to demonstrate a much wider point, he told MPs. And so it was today that the scoop revealed by Ed Conway of Sky News that the government is paying on a daily rate $7,360 per day to the management consultants at Boston Consulting Group, who are in charge of the test and trace, equivalent to 1.5 million salary to individuals as a day rate to preside over this shambolic site that is letting down all the people in my constituency and so many others. Mr. Perkins called for dedicated public servants to be drafted in to the test and trace system. You won't find dedicated public servants being paid $7,500 per day. You won't find them on a 1.5 million per year. But what you will find is a basic competence and a knowledge of the area, a desire to make sure that the systems work before they're implemented, he said. So basically, they're giving this money to private contractors instead of using our own existing civil system, which would be probably 2/3 the cost. So it's not in our interests to allow this continuation of private-public partnership, especially when it comes to giving private corporations the role of what our civil system covers. It's just money for nothing, but then it's money for the occupation. It's money for the British Empire. And that's something that's really going to have to be understood by everybody, that the British Empire is not England. The British Empire is not Wales. The British Empire is not Scotland. Those nations are Christian and have their own constitution. Now, Wales has always been part of England until it was divided up. So it's not even a separate country. You know, the separation has been created on purpose to dilute the ability for the people of this isle, the British Isles, to come together to oppose what is the British Empire. It's the British Empire that's flooding this nation with immigrants. It's the British Empire that's shifting our civil system into the private realm and paying them ridiculous amounts of money, as we've just discovered here. You know, it's all being shoved into private hands, and the fact the military are involved is a really worrying sign that they're acting according to the naval format, which is robbery or piracy that's legal and you keep the booty, but of course it's then shared out by the mafiosos above. So this is basically what the British Empire is. It's not English, it's not American, it's the British Empire that's taking over the nations. This is what's actually happening. So if you're British, you need to just reevaluate that term, because if you're not happy with what's happening in England today, the immigration, the fact that all your money's paying for this, the fact that this government has pulled you into so much debt, it's just, it's ridiculous. The figures are just so obscene. It doesn't bear thinking about, but we do need to think about these things. So the British Empire is the crown, not the monarch, though it has co-opted the office of monarch to its cause. It's the Crown Temple, it's the Templars. It's the Templars versus the Knights Hospitallers. Yeah? St. John, and it's that system. And it always has been the Templars versus the chivalric Knights of England. And they've took it over, the Civil War being one of the main points at which everything shifted under the Scottish Templar Whigamore system. Now, the term Tories is synonymous again with conservative. The original meaning to the term Tory was actually Catholic bandits, believe it or not. That's the actual original term when you go back. Yeah, the Tories were classed as the Catholic bandits. And they were named so because back in the day, they wanted to keep English constitutional system in place. Now, that works contrary to what people might believe, because people believe it's the Protestant system alone that created England. Well, it wasn't. Rome created England under Alfred. Now, I suggested in a couple of reports that I've put out last year that England is possibly another occupational title. Previous to that, the occupational title was Britannia, as we were under Rome. We were a province of Rome. As Rome collapsed, everything seemed to go back into its own thing, which they called the Dark Age, until they threw in the Scandinavians tied to Byzantium, the Varangian Guard, as we know as the Vikings. But they're not actually the Vikings. The Vikings is a term for an adventure. These were Northmen. So they were Danes, they were Swedes, they were Norwegians. But ultimately, there's a tie to Byzantium if you follow the old Silk Road. And the Byzantium emperors had a big body of Northmen as the guard called the Varangian Guard. So we can see that this has been quite a long-winded game. So if we're looking at Alfred, what we're probably seeing is Rome battling Byzantium. Rome gained its position when it pulled in the 1066 invasion. That has failed, obviously, because it was then usurped through the Crusades. Because what they actually did was the barony that existed here, to be encouraged to go to crusade, were encouraged to hand all the property and estates into trust, which were then usurped through King John and his sheriffs. They then backed, with the courts, the trustees' claim to the lands and titles owned by the barons that had gone off to crusade. So when you're looking at 1215 and you're looking at the Magna Carta, this was the English barons moving against the Templar input into England through John, and moved to remove the estates from the landed gentry of England. Interesting. Big money's being spent, your money. You remember this, when council speaks of money, it's your money. When government speaks of money, it's your money. Because they're tying the debt to you. They're socialising the debt and capitalising the profits. That's what private partnerships do. Yeah, they capitalise the profits to the corporations, the Crown, and any debts, any liabilities, because it's a public-private partnership, are shoved onto the taxpayer, or socialising the debt. Same with the 5G and the mobile technology. The industry can't get insurance, so they've entrapped the councillors through giving planning permission, which puts all the liabilities for the technology onto you, the taxpayer. So can you see the slide? So you've got the British Empire, which is all the private corporations. And then you've got nations. You've got England, you've got Scotland, you've got Wales, you've got United States of America, and as its individual states. You've got all the nations of Europe. You've got France, you've got Holland, you've got Germany. Now, when you trace this to the bloodlines that are actually operating this, so the Prussian bloodlines. The Prussian bloodlines in the 1700s took over England through the Hanoverians. They took over France, they took over Holland, they took over Germany, because the Prussians are not necessarily the original German people. This is a separate bunch, a separate line. So the Prussians took over Russia in the 1700s, who then took over the entire Crimea, especially the Khazars. The Khazars were putting the pogroms in Russia. So you can see where this Khazarian Talmudic Judaism comes from. It comes via Russia, but it also comes, its ultimate controls of it are the Prussian bloodlines. And of course the Prussian bloodlines moved here to England in deals done before the First World War, between the First and Second World War, and have continued ever since. And of course the Prussians had to destroy Germany, which they did in the Second World War. The First World War pretty much destroyed England, or Britain as it was, and pushed it and pulled it into this corporate system. The copyrights and patents moved to the United States because they inserted the Federal Reserve, and thus was born the military might of this British Empire, this private empire that's destroying England today. So it's important that the English, the Scottish and the Welsh, and even the Irish, because the Irish have been annihilated with this also. So we have to class ourselves as colonies of the British Empire. That's what's happened to the nations, the England, Scotland, the states in the United States, to France, to Germany, to the entire European landmass. And the sword of this empire has been used for a long time is Sunni Islam. They used them to take over big parts of India and created Pakistan. You know, they've been very clever in the use of the Sunni Muslims, because the Sunni Muslims, when you start to understand how Pakistan works, and I get this from my Muslim friends, you know, my Muslim friends taught me everything I needed to know. And we've all, you know, between us, we realised that we're all being attacked here. Now, in Pakistan specifically, Muslims here, born here, can only travel back to Pakistan safely if their families over in Pakistan are classed as in with the police. This is how it works in Pakistan. So the Muslims and the police as tied together is a natural process for Muslims from Pakistan and Kashmir. That's the normal way. That's the way it works. If you're not tied in with the police, you're in a mess. And to the point that your Muslim families from here can only go back to Pakistan safely if their families in Pakistan are very tied into the police. So naturally, when they come over here, it's ingrained in their psyche to support the police. So the police intelligence of the British Empire have managed to co-opt Muslims into the British system as opposed to they've emigrated to England. So this is the kind of trickery that's gone on. And it's very important now that British, English, Scottish people understand that there's a major difference between the British Empire and the nation in which you live. So that has to swim in your mind in order you can grasp what it is that guys like me are bringing to the table for you to mull on. So you can understand what it is that's actually destroying the nation, what's bringing in the immigration, that's removing all your economy into the private hands, and then dishing out fines, etc. Because we are classed as under occupation of the British Empire, as England. And now what these freaks have been doing across the world since the Hanoverians took over, especially since the Rothschilds took over, is exactly what we're facing here today. And I know that majority of you out there in England, in Scotland, in Wales, had no idea that this, what we're seeing and witnessing today, is exactly what the British Empire has been doing for centuries in other nations. And what they've actually been doing is installing communist regimes, as we learned from Dr. John Coleman in his series of books on the Committee of 300. And it's the Committee of 300 that administers the British Empire globally. So all nations are now tied into this empire. The problem we've got today is that the majority of the world see it as England. No, it's not. It's a sovereign state in London. It's always been so, and it's an instrument of the Holy See. It's not an instrument of the Vatican per se, it's an instrument of the Holy See, as the Vatican is also an instrument of the Holy See. It's these families, the financiers, these are the controllers of this system. Now, whether the Prussians have took over the Holy See over the centuries is a question that we could probably benefit from if people were prepared to have a look at that. But we really do need to understand that this is not one nation game. This is an empire. As it grabs a nation, will then utilise that nation for whatever it's renowned for, whether that's military might, whether that's economic might, skills in engineering and productivity. And then naturally, so same with China, we all blame China, but China again has been co-opted into this empire and has been chosen to be the nation that would set up the social system the intent to set across the world. And as you can see today, it's a medical dictatorship, and you're going to be run through your phone. You've got these apps that they want to put in your phone, which the apps will tell you whether you've got some kind of disease, whether you have to go home, whether you have to do this, do that. And this needs to be understood. So China is just the nation where they set this together because it was out of the Western media radar. So they could do it quite comfortably without it, coming out to the rest of the world. So just get a grip of what they're doing with this test and trait. But more importantly, understand that they're co-opting the military. And there's a video out of RAF on the thing. So they're co-opting our armed forces into the private arena. And obviously they'll be taking a cut of this booty. 12 billion they've intended is the projected costs for this track and trace. You're paying it. This is important. I think people have a disconnect there that, when the government's talking about money, they forget that it's your money. When your council are talking about budgets and money, it's your money. If you stop funding these people, they wouldn't have your money. They'd be bankrupt, which they already are. And that's important that we understand. When something goes bankrupt, you fold the damn thing. Here in this nation, we'd have to fold the government because it's a corporation that's bankrupt and go back to their English realm. That is what we are calling for. The English realm is not the British realm. You really need to understand this. It's title. These names that we associate as part of us are actually titles. And they're titles of occupation franchises. Yeah, it's got to be understood in those terms. So the British Empire is the enemy of everybody. It's the enemy of Christianity. It's the enemy of the Hebrew tradition. And it's trying to enforce this new system over everybody for the one world religion, which is of the Talmud. So you can mull on that. There's plenty there to go at, but don't lose sight of these figures that they're throwing about. They're huge. And they're tying our economy They're tying you and your children as the debtors that are going to be paying this back forever. So, on that note, I will say, till the next time.